In the silence of the untamed West, where snow drifts against broken fences and grief lingers like smoke in the rafters, a weary rancher expected nothing but a plain bride. Yet the woman who arrived carried both beauty and fire, awakening a desire he had long buried and a chance at love he feared to claim. The stagecoach groaned as it rolled across the frozen prairie, its wheels sinking deep into ruts carved by earlier rains. The sky hung low and gray, swollen with the promise of more snow before nightfall. Clara sat with her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, her shawl drawn close at the throat. She had worn the same garment for 3 winters now, and though the fabric was thinning at the edges, it held the faint scent of lavender, reminding her of the home she had left behind. She kept her eyes fixed on the blurred horizon, as if staring hard enough might soften the truth of her future. The driver called out as the ranch came into view. Clara leaned forward. The place looked smaller than she had imagined, almost swallowed by the sweep of land around it. A weathered house crouched against the wind, its porch sagging, its windows dull with dust. Fences leaned where cattle once roamed, and a scatter of tools lay rusting by the shed door. It was not ruin, but it was not far from it. When the coach stopped, Clara stepped down onto hard ground. Her boots sank into a thin crust of snow. She drew a slow breath, steadying herself as though preparing for judgment. A man waited near the hitching post, broad-shouldered, dark-coated, a slouch hat pulled low against the wind. Elias. He did not step forward, did not lift her hand in greeting. His eyes moved over her quickly, as though assessing her sturdiness the way one might judge a mule or a plow. He had expected plainness, a woman worn down by years of hard use. Instead, before him stood a widow with a figure still graceful despite her sorrow, and a face that, though pale from the journey, carried a quiet beauty. Her hair, braided beneath her bonnet, glinted the color of chestnuts in the fading light. The sight unsettled him. Beauty was not a gift here. It was a risk, a reminder of desires he had long buried beside the woman whose grave marked the hill behind the house. His jaw tightened. "You'll find supper inside," he said at last. His voice was low even, but cool. "Best come in before the snow deepens." Clara lowered her eyes, her fingers tightening around the strap of her carpet bag. She had imagined, perhaps foolishly, that he would smile or at least soften upon meeting her. Instead, his tone felt more like duty than welcome. She followed as he turned toward the house, her breath fogging in the sharp air. Inside, the air was warmer but no less spare. A fire burned low in the hearth, its light catching the edges of rough-hewn furniture. The walls were plain, unadorned save for the mounted rifle above the mantel. In one corner sat a rocking chair, empty, its seat polished by long use. Clara's gaze lingered on it before she looked away. "You can set your things there," Elias said, nodding to a trunk near the wall. He unbuttoned his coat, hung it on a peg, then crossed to the stove. Without looking at her, he stirred the pot that simmered there. The smell of beans and salt pork filled the room. Clara moved carefully, placing her bag down as though entering a stranger's church. She slipped off her shawl, shook free the dust of travel, and folded it over one arm. The silence pressed thick between them. She wished for the sound of conversation, even simple pleasantries, but none came. At last, Elias set 2 bowls on the table and gestured for her to sit. They ate in near silence, save for the ticking of the stove and the wind rattling the shutters. Clara kept her eyes on the food, though she felt his gaze upon her more than once, quick and guarded, as though ashamed to look too long. When the meal was done, Elias cleared the bowls without a word. Clara rose to help, but he shook his head. "You've traveled far. Rest," he said. She hesitated, then nodded. He showed her to a small room at the back of the house. The bed there was plain but clean, a quilt folded at its foot. She set her shawl across the chair and opened her bag. From its depths she drew a small Bible, worn thin at the edges, and set it on the table beside the bed. Beneath it lay her late husband's pocket watch, silent now, its hands frozen where it had stopped months ago. She closed her eyes against the sudden ache of memory. Through the thin wall she heard Elias move about the house, the scrape of chair legs, the slow pacing of boots across the floorboards. His silence weighed heavier than any words might have. She sensed he was a man who had grown accustomed to absence, to empty rooms, to conversations left unsaid. Clara lay down at last, the quilt pulled to her chin. She felt neither welcome nor rejected, but held at a distance, As though her presence stirred in him something he dared not name, she stared into the dark, listening to the wind whistle through the eaves, and promised herself she would endure. She had been abandoned before, left to fend for herself when her husband's debts consumed everything. She had survived shame and whispers. She would survive this too. In the main room, Elias sat before the fire, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the flames. The rocking chair stood silent beside him. He could not bring himself to touch it, not yet. His new bride slept only a wall away, and the knowledge unsettled him. She was not what he expected. She was too alive, too present, too much a reminder of all he had lost. Outside, snow began to fall, sifting across the barren yard, softening the edges of the broken fences and rusting tools. By morning the land would be white and still, hiding the scars of use and weather. Elias closed his eyes, hearing the fire crackle, feeling the weight of loneliness pressing against the door he had long kept shut. He feared that if he let it open, even an inch, the fire might consume him, and yet beyond the wall, another fire already burned, the quiet strength of a woman who had traveled into exile, not plain, not fragile, but enduring. The morning after her arrival, Clara rose early before the sun had lifted the frost from the windows. The house was still and cold. She wrapped her shawl about her shoulders and opened her small trunk at the foot of the bed. Inside lay the few belongings she had carried west: a Bible, its cover softened by years of turning, a pocket watch that no longer ticked, its chain dulled, and at the very bottom, folded carefully in tissue, a wedding dress she would never again wear. Her fingers lingered on the fabric, pale ivory, still smooth despite the miles it had traveled with her. It carried the scent of cedar from the chest it had once been stored in, back in her father's house. She lifted it briefly, then folded it away again, as though touching it too long might open a wound she was not ready to bear. From the main room came the sound of boots on wooden planks. Elias was already at his chores, moving with steady purpose. Clara watched him briefly through the doorway as he gathered his hat and coat. He avoided the rocking chair by the hearth, walking around it as if it were a grave marker. She noticed how his gaze flickered there and away, quick and sharp. Before he stepped outside into the pale light of dawn, Clara drew a breath and began her own small tasks. Sweeping the boards, heating water for coffee, folding the quilt. She had been raised to believe work steadied the soul, and she clung to that lesson now. Later, Elias returned, his boots tracked with mud, his coat damp from melting frost. He nodded at the coffee on the table but said little. His silence was not cruel, she decided, but careful, like a man handling something fragile that he feared might break in his hands. At night, she heard him. When the house should have been asleep, the boards creaked beneath his pacing. She lay awake, listening as his boots crossed and recrossed the floor. Sometimes the sound stopped near the hearth where the chair stood, and she could almost imagine him reaching out, only to retreat again. Then the footsteps would resume, restless, haunted. Days stretched into weeks. Clara accompanied Elias into town when supplies were needed. The settlement was small, a scatter of buildings clinging to the edge of the prairie. As they entered, heads turned. Whispers followed, snatches of words carried just loud enough to sting. Bought bride. Desperate rancher. Not the first he's buried. Clara straightened her spine, her shawl drawn tighter around her. She did not look away, did not flinch. She had lived with whispers before, when her late husband's debts had left her begging mercy from neighbors, when pity had turned to scorn. She had learned to let silence shield her. Outside the mercantile, she noticed a boy sitting cross-legged in the dust. His hair was long and braided, his skin coppered by sun and lineage. He held bundles of sweetgrass, their fragrance rising faint and clean above the smell of horses and dust. His eyes, dark and wary, lifted to hers, and for a heartbeat she felt the same loneliness she carried reflected in his gaze. "How much?" she asked softly. The boy hesitated, then named a sum so small she knew it was less than the worth of his labor. Clara placed the coins in his hand and took a braid, holding it to her face. The scent was earthy, sharp, like fields after rain. She thanked him. Elias, watching from the boardwalk, said nothing. Yet when she glanced at him, she caught something flicker in his eyes, not displeasure, not disapproval, but a strange kind of respect, quickly hidden. That evening, Clara hung the sweetgrass above her bed. Its scent filled the room, gentler than lamp oil, more enduring than wood smoke. It reminded her that even in exile, beauty and meaning could be carried. Elias noticed, though he did not speak of it. He only lingered a moment at her door that night, his shadow long in the lamplight before retreating to his chair by the fire. The days passed slow, measured by chores, weather, and the slow thaw of snow into mud. Clara worked beside Elias when he allowed it, mending rails, carrying water, tending to chickens that clucked nervously at her unfamiliar presence. She felt his eyes on her sometimes, steady and unreadable. Once, when she struggled to lift a bucket too heavy for her arms, he stepped forward as though to help. But then he stopped, fists tightening at his sides, and let her finish the task alone. She saw the conflict in him, the war between duty and distance. He did not want to owe her gratitude. He did not want to need her. That night, as firelight flickered across the room, Clara dared to hum an old tune, soft, almost under her breath, as she mended a tear in her skirt. The melody had been sung by her mother once and by herself on quieter nights when loneliness pressed close. She felt Elias stiffen across the room. He turned his head sharply, gaze fixed on the flames. The tune had belonged perhaps to another time, another woman who had once sat in that same chair humming while he worked. Clara faltered, the song fading into silence. His face was unreadable, but his hands clenched, knuckles pale. He rose abruptly, muttering something about checking the stock, and left the house. The door closed with a hollow thud, leaving Clara with her half-mended skirt and the echo of her song. For a long time she sat in the stillness, staring at the empty chair across from her. She thought of the wedding dress folded in her trunk, of the boy in town selling sweetgrass, of Elias's pacing footsteps in the night. She began to see that his silence was not indifference but burden. He lived in a house crowded with memory, where even the simplest sound could awaken sorrow. And though his distance stung her, she found a strange, fragile strength in recognizing it. She was not fragile herself, not anymore. She'd been broken before, and yet she endured. If Elias believed her delicate, he was mistaken. In time, perhaps, he would see it too. The storm came without warning, sweeping across the plains with a fury that swallowed the horizon. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of lead, the wind howling like a chorus of wolves. Snow drove sideways, lashing the windows and piling in drifts against the porch. Inside the cabin, the air grew close with the smell of damp wool and wood smoke, as Elias stoked the fire high against the chill. Clara set another log on the flames, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The storm rattled the shutters and whistled through every crack in the walls. She thought of her father's parlor back east with velvet curtains and polished floors, and marveled at how far away such comforts now seemed. Here survival was measured by firewood, dry boots, and the strength to endure silence. Elias moved restlessly, his rifle leaning within easy reach. He was a man who measured threats in shadows, who trusted only the evidence of his own eyes. Yet even he paused when a pounding struck the door. The knock was ragged, desperate, almost swallowed by the gale. Elias stiffened, hand gripping the rifle stock. Clara's breath caught. No traveler should be out in weather like this. When Elias opened the door, the wind shoved it wide, carrying snow into the room. A figure staggered inside, half collapsing against the frame. His coat was torn, his face raw with cold, a smear of blood dark against his temple. A revolver hung at his hip, though his hand no longer had the strength to hold it steady. Elias knew him. Recognition flared across his face like lightning. This was a drifter he had seen before, caught once with cattle not his own. A man whispered to take what was not offered. Clara was already at the man's side, steadying him. "He'll freeze if he stays out there," she said firmly. "Help me." Elias hesitated, suspicion taut as a bowstring. But Clara's eyes held no doubt, only resolve. Against his better judgment, he slid the rifle back into its place and lifted the man by the arm. Together they lowered him near the fire. Clara stripped away the man's wet coat, her hands quick, efficient. She fetched water, tore strips of cloth from her own shift, and cleaned the wound on his temple. When she saw him shiver violently, she did not hesitate to unwrap her only good shawl, the one she had worn from the stagecoach, and drape it across his shoulders. "You'll need that," Elias muttered. "He needs it more," she replied, not looking up. The drifter groaned, half-conscious, muttering words neither of them understood. Clara hushed him softly, her touch gentle but unyielding. Elias stood nearby, arms crossed, his shadow cast tall by the fire. His eyes never left the stranger, but often they strayed to Clara, watching the patience with which she worked. The hours dragged. The storm clawed at the walls, rattled the windows, shook the very beams of the house. Elias kept the fire fed and his rifle within reach. Clara, kneeling by the stranger, bathed his fevered skin with cool cloths. In the firelight, her face was calm, steadfast, more determined than afraid. Elias saw it then, saw the quiet strength that had brought her across miles of wilderness and silence. She was not fragile, not a piece of porcelain to be set upon a shelf. She was iron beneath softness, and mercy was her defiance against despair. When she rose at last to rest her knees, she found Elias watching her. Their eyes met briefly, a flash like the strike of flint. He looked away first, unsettled, as though caught in a thought too dangerous to hold. Through the long night, the storm did not relent. The wind moaned in the chimney, snow hissed against the shutters, and the stranger's breathing rasped between them. Elias dozed lightly in the chair, his rifle across his knees. Clara dozed on the floor by the hearth, her shawl now absent from her shoulders, her hands still curled as though ready to rise again if the man stirred. Near dawn, the storm began to break. Silence fell slowly like a great beast settling into sleep. The wind softened, the snow eased its grip. Pale light crept through the frosted glass. The drifter stirred, eyes flickering open. He looked around, confusion clouding his face. His hand twitched toward his revolver, but Elias's voice cut through the room. "Leave it," he said, low even. The man froze, then slumped back, too weak to argue. Clara bent over him. "You'll live," she said quietly, "but you'll need rest." The stranger closed his eyes again, surrendering. Clara smoothed the blanket over his chest, her touch steady. Elias watched her, his jaw tight. He did not understand this impulse of hers, to offer mercy where caution demanded distance. Yet something in him shifted as he saw the way she stood her ground, unafraid, unwilling to let fear dictate her kindness. When the sun at last rose, the storm lay buried in drifts across the land. The cabin was still warm with firelight, heavy with the smell of smoke and damp wool. Elias set the rifle aside just for a moment and leaned back in his chair. Clara sat across from him, her face drawn with fatigue but her eyes alive, steady, unbroken. Between them lay the silence of things unspoken, suspicion, gratitude, longing, and the risk of trust. For the first time since her arrival, Elias felt the stillness shift. It was not comfort, not yet, but it was a beginning, fragile as dawn breaking over snow. The storm did not pass quickly. For 3 days it pressed against the cabin, winds shrieking through the chinks in the walls, snow piling high against the door until daylight itself seemed trapped outside. The world shrank to 4 walls, a hearth, and the uneasy company of 3 souls bound together by circumstance. The stranger, his name still unspoken, remained weak, though strength slowly returned to his limbs. He slept often, shifting restlessly, sometimes muttering in fevered dreams. Clara tended him without hesitation, bringing broth to his lips, wiping sweat from his brow. She moved with quiet efficiency, her face calm though her hands trembled in private when she thought no one was looking. Elias kept his rifle close, but as hours stretched into days, even he relented, lowering suspicion into vigilance rather than open hostility. He carried tasks indoors to occupy his restlessness, mending a fence rail with knife and mallet, shaping its splintered edge by firelight. Each crack of the mallet echoed like gunshot in the confined room, reminding them all of the world waiting beyond the storm. The air grew taut with silence, thick as smoke. Each glance, each brush of movement carried more weight than words. When Clara set a plate before Elias at the table, her hand lingered a fraction too long on the wood. His own hand, reaching for the spoon, nearly touched hers. He drew back as if burned, eyes dropping to the food as though it might accuse him of weakness. Clara noticed more than he wished her to. She saw the stiffness in his gait when he rose, the faint wince he tried to hide when lifting weight, the scars that ran white across his knuckles where old injuries had healed poorly. She saw, too, the way he avoided her gaze when her presence drew too near. It was not disdain, she could feel that now, but fear of something he could not name. On the second night, the stranger's fever broke. He slept heavily by the fire, breathing deep and even, Clara sat nearby, darning socks with needle and thread. The steady rhythm of the work soothed her. Almost without thinking, she began to hum, a hymn her mother had once sung at dusk, a tune she had carried since childhood. The sound was soft, no more than a thread of melody, but it filled the room with warmth. Elias, hunched over his half-mended rail, froze. The tune pierced him like a blade. His late wife had sung it once, her voice rising from the same place by the fire where Clara now sat. For a moment, time folded. Memory and present collided. Elias's breath hitched. He stared into the flames, the mallet slipping from his hand. Clara, startled, looked up. She saw the grief storm across his face, raw, unguarded, unbearable. Then he rose abruptly, almost violently, pushing the broken rail aside. "Enough," he muttered, voice hoarse. Clara blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Don't—" He stopped, fists clenched, jaw tight. His eyes, when they met hers, were dark with torment. "Don't sing that." "Not here." The words landed like a slap. Clara's lips parted, hurt flooding her expression. She lowered her gaze. The hymn silenced, the needle slipping against the wool in her lap. Elias turned away, ashamed even as the words left him. He strode to the door, yanked it open against the storm, and stepped into the freezing night. Wind and snow swallowed him. Inside, Clara sat rigid, her heart hammering. She had not meant to wound him. The hymn had been hers long before she knew his name, long before she crossed into this barren land. Yet she saw now that every sound in this house carried ghosts. Every kindness risked reopening scars. Her eyes burned, but she would not cry. She bent her head once more to her work, stitching by firelight, steadying her hands against the tremor of rejection. When Elias returned, snow clung to his coat and hat. His face was pale, his beard rimed with frost. He removed neither garment nor boots, only crossed to the hearth and stood there silent as water dripped from him onto the floorboards. Clara did not look up. The stranger stirred faintly, mumbling in his sleep, and Clara rose to adjust his blanket. Her movements were calm, deliberate, as if she had not heard Elias's harsh words at all. Yet when she sat again, she did not hum. Elias felt the absence like a cavern. Guilt gnawed at him, sharp and unrelenting. He had lashed out not at her, but at the living memory she had awakened. Yet she bore the wound. He wanted to speak, to apologize, but the words locked tight in his chest. His silence, once his shield, now became his prison. Through the long hours of that night, the storm raged on. Elias dozed in the chair. Clara stitched until her eyes blurred, and the stranger slept between them, the fragile tether that kept them from breaking entirely apart. In the stillness, Clara's realization settled cold but clear. Survival here would demand more than endurance. If she withdrew, if she allowed rejection to harden her, she would vanish into the silence Elias carried like a shroud. No, she would remain open, even if it cost her. Mercy was not weakness. It was strength. And she would not surrender it. Elias, half asleep in his chair, dreamed of the rocking chair by the hearth, of a hymn sung in another voice, of firelight dancing across hair that was not the same, though memory tried to make it so. When he woke, he saw Clara still at her sewing, her face illuminated by the same fire, and something inside him ached with both longing and regret. He realized then, though he could not yet speak it, that he had punished her for a past she had never lived. She was no ghost, no replacement. She was flesh and breath, strength and sorrow, and he feared her not because she was weak, but because she was alive. The storm continued, but inside the cabin another storm brewed, silent and unseen, and when it broke, it would leave none of them unchanged. By the fourth morning, the storm had weakened, though its shadow lingered. Drifts lay deep against the fences, and the wind still cut sharp as knives across the prairie. The stranger had regained enough strength to sit upright, his face pale but his eyes steady. He ate slowly, careful with each spoonful Clara handed him, but there was little gratitude in his manner. When Elias asked his name, the man only shrugged. "Names don't matter much out here," he muttered. His voice was rough, like gravel ground under boots. Clara studied him with quiet unease. His gaze carried bitterness, not simply the wariness of a man recovering from fever. It was the bitterness of someone who had lived too long on the edge of hunger and contempt. "They'll run you out," he said at last, his words low, meant more for Elias than for her. "Settlers, natives, it doesn't matter. This land doesn't want you. It'll break you same as it broke me." Elias's jaw tightened. "You made your choices. The stranger laughed bitterly. And you think yours are different? You fence land that once lay open. You claim what others called sacred. Don't think there won't be blood. His eyes flicked toward Clara, a shadow passing over his expression. Best you keep her safe. The warning lingered after he left. Elias saddled his horse in silence, ignoring Clara's protest. I'll ride out, he said. See what truth there is in his words. Clara followed him to the door, the cold rushing in around them. Elias, she said softly, you don't have to. I do. His voice was firm, though the weariness in his eyes betrayed the cost. He rode into the snow-washed horizon, a solitary figure swallowed by distance. Clara watched until he vanished, her breath clouding in the air. She returned inside to wait, tending the fire, stitching quietly to still her restless hands. The hours stretched like wire pulled too tight. When Elias returned near dusk, his coat was torn, his cheek bruised, and blood stained the edge of his sleeve. Clara ran to him, her fear swallowed only by relief. What happened? She whispered. Trouble brewing, he said simply, voice hoarse. Raiders, some driven by hunger, some by anger. Not yet, but soon. He swayed where he stood. Clara guided him to the chair by the fire, her hands firm despite their trembling. She fetched water, cloth, and a jar of salve, her movement swift and sure. Elias did not resist as she rolled back his sleeve, revealing a gash along his arm. He hissed when the water touched it, but her hands did not falter. The nearness between them was charged, heavy with all that had gone unspoken. His skin burned beneath her touch, not only from fever but from the closeness he had long denied himself. She leaned near, the lamplight catching the strands of her hair, and for a moment he could scarcely breathe. You'll mend, she said, her voice steady though her heart raced. But you must stop thinking you have to bear every wound alone. Elias looked at her, really looked, and saw not fragility but defiance. Mercy wielded like a weapon against despair. He wanted to speak, to tell her what weighed on him, but words failed. He only nodded, and she bound the wound with strips of clean cloth, her fingers brushing his skin like a promise. When the task was done, Clara sat across from him by the fire, her sewing abandoned. The room was still save for the crackle of flames and the distant groan of wind. At last she spoke into the silence. I came here because I had nowhere else, she said softly, because I was tired of being unwanted. I thought survival was enough. Her gaze lifted to his, steady despite the tears shining there. But I wanted more than survival. I wanted to belong to someone, to somewhere, even if it was only in silence. The word struck him harder than any blow. He had thought her presence a burden pressed upon him, a reminder of debts he did not wish to carry, but now he saw the truth. She had chosen to endure this loneliness beside him, not because she was weak, but because she still hoped for belonging in a world that had cast her aside. Elias reached for the rifle that leaned against the hearth. His hand lingered on it, the steel cold against his palm. Then slowly, deliberately, he set it aside. The gesture was simple, yet it carried the weight of laying down old battles, against raiders, against grief, against himself. Clara's eyes followed the motion. She understood. Her hand, resting on the arm of her chair, trembled slightly. His hand, broad and scarred, drifted near. Their fingers brushed, light as breath, yet the contact seared through them both. Neither pulled away. They did not speak, did not lean closer, did not seal the moment with anything so fragile as a kiss. Instead, the silence deepened, filled with the warmth of firelight and the quiet thunder of hearts long denied. The flames cast shadows across the walls, flickering like ghosts that slowly withdrew, leaving the two of them in the living present. Elias met Clara's gaze, and in her eyes he saw not replacement, not intrusion, but life. Life he could choose to claim if only he dared. For Clara, the moment was a balm against years of abandonment. She was no longer merely tolerated, no longer a burden to be endured. She was seen, chosen without words, her presence accepted as fire was accepted against the cold. The night passed slowly, the storm outside retreating into silence. They sat together until the fire burned low, hands resting side by side, the rifle forgotten. And in that quiet, something new was born, not loudly, not with sudden passion, but with the steady, enduring strength of embers refusing to die. The thaw never came that winter. Snow lay deep across the plains, hard and glittering under a sky that carried no mercy. But the storm within the land was no longer weather alone. Word drifted from the settlement. Raiders had been seen circling homesteads, men hardened by hunger, anger, and old grudges. Elias knew they would not pass by forever. Trouble always came calling. This time it was not only his land he feared to lose, but the woman who had come into his silence like an unlooked-for flame. When the first shots cracked through the air one bitter evening, Clara was already at the door, rifle in her hands. Elias turned, startled at the sight of her, shawl about her shoulders, eyes steady as stone. "You shouldn't," he began. "I will," she answered, her voice even. "I will stand with you." The words pierced deeper than the cold. He gave a short nod, and side by side they stepped into the yard, breath smoking in the twilight. Shadows moved beyond the fences, dark against the snow. The raiders shouted, their voices harsh, daring them to yield. Elias lifted his rifle, Clara raising hers beside him. The fight was brief but sharp, a blaze of powder in the night. Shots rang, echoes crashing across the frozen land. One raider fell, another cursed and fled. The rest, seeing resistance was fierce, scattered like crows startled from a carcass. Silence returned, heavy and brittle. When the smoke cleared, Elias glanced at Clara. She still gripped the rifle, her breath quick but her hands steady. In that moment, no words were needed. His vow was written in the way he looked at her, an unspoken devotion born not of duty but of respect. From the shadows of the barn, another figure emerged. The stranger, the drifter they had once nursed through fever, had returned. His face was gaunt, his eyes torn between bitterness and something softer. "You stood," he said, his tone half mocking, half awed. "Most would have hidden. You didn't." "We defend what's ours," Elias said curtly. The man's gaze lingered on Clara. "Mercy's a strange weapon, maybe stronger than bullets. Don't squander it." He shifted as though burdened by a weight unseen. Then without further word he turned into the night, footsteps fading into the snow. His leaving felt like the closing of an old wound, something festering that at last was cut free. When dawn came, pale and clear, Elias saddled his horse. Clara stood at the gate, watching, uncertain. But instead of riding away, he extended his hand. "Come," he said simply. She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. He lifted her to the saddle before him, and together they rode across the white-drifted prairie. The land stretched endless, silent save for the steady beat of hooves. The wind tangled her hair, stung her cheeks, yet she felt no cold. For the first time, Elias spoke plainly, his voice low against her ear. "I took you in because I thought I needed someone to keep the house. A duty, nothing more. But that was a lie I told myself. Truth is, I want you here, not for what you can do, for who you are." Clara's breath caught. She had braced herself for rejection, for silence that would never yield. Now the weight she had carried for years, the weight of being unwanted, lifted like snow sliding from a roof. She turned her face slightly, enough that he could see the truth shining in her eyes. "Then I am not only surviving here," she whispered. "I am home." They rode until the ranch came into sight. Once it had seemed barren, a place stripped bare by sorrow. Now with Clara pressed against him, it looked different. The fences waiting for repair, the barn leaning, the fields lying fallow. All of it seemed less like ruin and more like promise. A place of second chances. That night the fire burned steady. Elias sat in his chair. The rifle leaned quietly in the corner, forgotten. Clara settled into the rocking chair by the hearth, the same chair he had once avoided as though haunted by a ghost. Her shawl draped around her shoulders, her face bathed in the glow of firelight. For a long time, Elias simply watched. Fear had kept him from looking before, but now he saw not the shadow of what he had lost, but the living strength before him. She hummed softly, the tune of a hymn, and the sound no longer cut him with memory. It soothed, like a river finding its course. The chair, once a shrine to grief, was no longer empty. The cabin, once hollow with silence, was filled with the quiet presence of belonging. Elias leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes never leaving her. Clara met his gaze and did not look away. No vows were spoken, no rings exchanged. Only the fire, the shawl, the slow creak of wood beneath her, and the man who had once expected nothing but plainness now seeing the truth. She was essential. Not ornament, not burden. The storm had passed. The land was still harsh, the future uncertain, but they had chosen life over grief, hope over fear, and in that choice the ranch was no longer just a place to endure. It was home,